But with snapback or with tougher U.S. imposition or enforcement of sanctions, the pipeline from Iran to China, the oil supply be curtailed?
Curtailed, yes. Stop, no. Stop, no. The people in China who buy this oil, these small refineries, and it's really hard to influence them. What the U.S. has been trying to do is to influence the ports where the ships pull in and the banks to which those refineries use. And the U.S. has had some success at doing that. But the general rule with sanctions is that the people on whom you sanction are spending more energy at trying to figure out ways to evade the sanctions than you are at enforcing them. And over time, the enforcement of sanctions becomes more and more difficult.
What's your assessment of Iran's neighbors' compliance with sanctions regimes that have been put in place?
The Iraqis in particular have a very complicated problem on their hands because there are large numbers of Iranians who visit Iraq for religious tourism reasons as well as for political reasons. And boy, it's hard to stop them from buying currency in Iran and taking it in Iraq and then taking it home with them. And the Iraqi authorities, that's not their priority. However, once the United States government makes it clear that the Iraqi banks would lose access to U.S. dollars, which they badly need, the Iraqi banks have gotten to be kind of okay about enforcing the sanctions. But the Iranians have turned out to be very clever at coming up with new ways to try to get around these restrictions. And so in recent months, there's been a lot done with ATM machines and with Visa debit cards.
Turkey also, for a while, was opposing an issue with sanctions enforcement.
Yeah, the Turks were a big problem about sanctions enforcement 10, 20 years ago, and frankly, less so now. But if the United States were successful at really blocking Iranians' access to the dollars through Iraq, we could expect that there'd be a lot more activity in Turkey. And of course, at one point, the Iranians were quite successful at operating in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates. That kind of dried up. Yeah. But again, it would restart. The Dubai is where a fair amount of the oil trade gets coordinated through Dubai, but not necessarily actively running through Dubai.
Yeah. I think there was also increasing cooperation between the U.S. and the UAE on these issues, but it's complicated, I know that. If snapback were imposed in October of this year, bringing back the sanctions that were set aside with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, would that change the dynamic?
The trade between Europe and Iran is quite substantial. European companies sell quite a lot of stuff to Iran, and that trade would be very badly affected by a snapback. Very badly affected by a snapback. But Iran sells less to Europe. It's nowhere they buy from Europe. But they do sell some things to Europe. So there would be an economic impact on Iran. Is that going to be sufficient to get Iran to change its policies? Not particularly, especially because the political and business mood in Iran has frankly gone from having great hopes in Europe 10, 20 years ago, kind of writing the Europeans off these days.
So the whole question of how one changes the behavior of a theocratic regime, would military action be sufficient to alter course for the Iranians? Would they put aside their nuclear ambitions because of military action by the United States and Israel? Or is it going to require a diplomatic solution? Or a combination?
I would say that an enduring solution is very difficult to achieve any way you look at it. And for instance, if we had an absolutely solid agreement with the Iranians, we would still have to have enforcement mechanisms, and we should anticipate that the Iranians would cheat on this. I mean, that's the history of these kinds of arms control agreements, is the people who accept them at gunpoint then proceed to cheat on them.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think Iran would be any exception to that general rule. So just as military action would require some kind of agreement afterwards to follow up, so too any kind of diplomatic agreement would require credible threats of military force to persuade Iran to observe this agreement more fully.
What level of confidence do you have that the current U.S. administration will be able to successfully pursue negotiations with the Iranian regime weakened after the attacks of last month?
Well, the Trump administration put on the table a rather generous offer to the Iranians, which was tailored as best it could to address some Iranian concerns about wanting to maintain an enrichment program while preserving the U.S. red line of no enrichment inside Iran. The Iranians never responded to that, and that's discouraging. And I hope that there are some people in Iran who've drawn lessons from, well, gee, why didn't we respond to that? You know, Trump in early days of this administration said that Iran has 60 days to negotiate. On the 61st day, Israel attacked.
Mm-hmm.
That should be a lesson.
Different aspect of all of this. It was made clear by the statements of President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu that the objective of the attacks on the nuclear and military sites was not regime change, but unstated, that seemed to be in the air as a hope, at least, that both of these governments, and I think more than just these two governments, would like to see a regime change in Tehran. Do you see that as a possibility, and could it grow from the events of the last month?
Well, I certainly think that 90% of Americans, and probably 80% of Iranians, would like to see a regime change. So it's hardly surprising that U.S. and Israeli politicians would say, well, we hope the regime changes. That's very different from actually trying to do anything about it. Now, regime change is coming in Iran because Khamenei is 86 years old, and he's not going to live forever. In fact, his recent television statements, he looks giving a run to Joe Biden for who's the most run down. And when there's a new supreme leader, things are going to be quite different, because this supreme leader is a real micromanager. So if he's not there, things will be different. His successor, whoever that is, will not inherit the elaborate mechanisms that Khamenei has set up in order to control things. Khamenei has left many competing institutions, each of which thinks that they're in charge. And without him there, I don't know what's going to happen. It's distinctly possible that the Revolutionary Guards will have a much greater say in running things in Iran. But again, there it's not clear what's going to happen, because it would appear that there are quite a number of people in the Revolutionary Guards, and quite a number of the statements have been made recently, which seem not that interested in revolutionary Islam, and much more interested in Iranian national power and Iranian national pride. And it might be possible to work out a deal with those kind of people.
Does that mean there would not necessarily be another supreme leader? It would be a different form of government as well?
I would suspect that we're probably going to see another supreme leader, but he'd be the not-so-supreme leader. So after all, it took this supreme leader better than 10 years to establish himself as really in charge. In the first few years, he was really quite the figurehead. Indeed, in the very detailed memoirs of former President Rafsanjani, he describes how Khamenei, a couple of years after he became supreme leader, came to see Rafsanjani, then the country's president and real power broker, and how many complained that he had nothing to do and that the job was really empty. It took Khamenei quite a while to make the supreme leader.
But I mean, going back in history, the Iranian people only in the last, 5 decades have had this kind of a form of governance.
So,
can they possibly go back to something
sure,
different and
sure,
maybe more representative of the will of the people?
Look, the history of the modern Middle East is the history of revolutionary regimes evolving into military-run dictatorships which claim to still be revolutionary. That was true in Egypt, that was true in Iraq, that was true in Syria. Well, we could have that again, and we could have that in Iran.
And that happens through external forces or internal forces?
No, that happens through the internal evolution of frankly, the people in the military wanting to enrich themselves more than they wanted to spread their revolutionary ideology. And I think that's true of a fair number of people in the Revolutionary Guards today.
Very interesting. Last question I have. What do you make of the condemnations of Israeli and U.S. actions last month expressed by Iran's neighbors across the Gulf? How do you assess the lack of material support, at least as far as we know, from Iran's putative allies in Moscow and Beijing?
Well, the Gulf countries were very upset that there was war once again on their doorstep.
Yeah.
They really thought that the region had moved to peace, and that the eras of wars nearby had come to an end. And so for them, this is not good. I mean, Qatari residents were very upset to see the missiles being shot down over Qatar. Mm-hmm. We may focus on the fact the missiles were shot down. I think that a lot of people living in Qatar are focused on the fact there were missiles up there.
Right.
And so it's not surprising that they were very upset that there was this war going on.
Right.
But nobody was particularly eager to help Iran. It's not just that Russia and China weren't particularly eager to help Iran. Where was Hezbollah? We had long assumed that in the event of Israel attacking Iran, that Hezbollah would pull out everything in order to attack Israel. No, not what happened at all.
But no one rushed to the defense of the Iranians.
Nobody came to the defense of the Iranians, period. How many Houthi missiles did you see? How many from the Iraqi militias did you see? Mm-hmm. How many from Hezbollah did you see? Not very much.
Very interesting. Patrick, this has been fascinating. I thank you for counseling us and for informing us on current developments and future developments, and allow us to come back to you in the future and keep track of what's happening between Iran and its neighbors and the world.
Unfortunately, I don't think we've solved all the problems in the region, and I suspect there will be many opportunities to talk about this in the future.
I look forward to it, Patrick. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on HAC Perspectives on TvAbraham.